So today we're going to unveil the results of our new report and research. And the report is called the Talent Justice Investing in Equity in the Nonprofit Workforce Report. This study was produced in partnership with the Center for Urban and Racial Equity. And our research explored the challenges, opportunities, and promising practices of investing in intersectional racial equity in the nonprofit workforce. So today we have over 230 people registered to join in on the conversation. So we really are excited about the interest that our colleagues have around this important topic. Due to the size of the audience that we have today, everybody's video has been disabled and your audio has been muted to avoid any disruption in sound. If you have any trouble with your computer audio, please make sure to use the dial-in number that's been provided in the chat box. And the way to locate the chat box is to click on chat at the bottom of your screen. So as I mentioned earlier, the webinar will be recorded, and we will make the recording and also the PowerPoint slides available after today. So on today's webinar, due to the size of the audience, we encourage you to share your questions for our presenters in the chat box so that we can address them during the, either during the presentation or during the Q&A and discussion period that we'll have later on today. So I'm happy to say that today Casey Yoder and Liz Ireland from Casey Yoder Consulting, they're providing tech support to make sure that today's webinar runs smoothly. Casey Yoder Consulting is also providing communication support for the launch of the Talent Justice Initiative. So now I'm going to just go over the agenda with you. So today we will cover the following in the webinar. First, we'll provide an overview of the Talent Justice Initiative and Fund the People. Then we'll turn to research findings and the recommendations in the Talent Justice Report. Then we'll turn to Q&A and discussion. So please keep those questions coming in the chat box. And then we'll share resources, and we'll share more information about the Talent Justice webinar series that's happening this summer. So, and then we'll wrap up. But before we get into the content of today's discussion, we'd like to get to know a little bit more about our audience. So I'd like to ask Casey if she can launch our first poll question. Okay, there we go. So the first question is, what stakeholder group or audience do you represent? So take a few seconds to fill out the poll. Don't be shy. We just want to know who everybody is on the webinar today. So I'll give you a few more seconds. Okay, we have 85% of you voting, so let's see if we can get close to 100. And then we will share the results. Okay. Okay, a few more people responded and polling, and share the results with the audience. Great, so we have a majority of participants representing nonprofits today, 65%, and then 20% foundations, and then a few consultants, some people in academia, and a few in the other category. Great, so let's build on that first poll. And I'll ask Casey to launch the next poll question. So we just want to know more about what role you hold at your organization. So let's take a few seconds to have you respond to those questions, that question. Just a few more seconds. Let's see if we can get better than 89% responses this time. All right, so let's stop this poll. So we have over half of the audience today representing middle management, and then we have a pretty even representation of frontline staff members and people in the C-suite, and a little bit less in the CEO executive director role. Great. So now I'm going to move on to introducing our presenters. So we can close this poll. Great. Okay, so I'm pleased to introduce to you my colleague, Rusty Stahl, who's president and CEO and founder of Fund the People. He stewards our vision and mobilizes resources for our mission. Rusty previously served as the founding executive director of Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy, the National Association of Young and New Foundation Professionals. We'll also be joined by Dr. Judy Lubin. She is president of the Center for Urban and Racial Equity. Dr. Lubin has 20 years of experience working at the intersection of equity, policy, research, and communications. In prior leadership positions and as a consultant and advisor, she has led equity-centered research, strategy design, and initiatives on behalf of more than 24 national organizations, foundations, and government agencies. So now I'd like to turn it over to Rusty.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Yolanda, for the great introduction. And more importantly, thanks for your leadership at Fund the People and for everything you've done to guide the Talent Justice Initiative to fruition and bring us to this moment today. Yeah. And I want to offer my own greetings to everyone who's on, listening live or later to this as a recording. Thanks for your service to our country and our communities as part of the nonprofit workforce. We're honored to have you on and for your time today. And thanks for being part of this important conversation on racial equity in our field and by implication in our larger society. With this webinar, Fund the People officially launches our Talent Justice Initiative. The launch primarily entails the online publication of a suite of materials meant to help grant makers and nonprofits and others to increase investment in equity in the nonprofit workforce. The suite of materials includes the research-based report that Yolanda mentioned already, an executive summary of the report, infographics related to the content in the report, and a toolkit that encompasses 10 tools meant to help you take action and learn more. Today, we'll be primarily talking about the research findings, and as Yolanda mentioned, this series of further webinars will offer more discussion and engagement with that content. Beyond the suite of the materials, Fund the People is introducing this phrase, talent justice, this idea of talent justice in the nonprofit sector. So I want to offer some context about Fund the People, this initiative, and our partners before Dr. Lubin shares the research findings. Okay, so I founded Fund the People in 2014 with the fundamental belief that the nonprofit workforce is essential to American democracy, to America's economy, and to the quality of life in our country. This belief has only grown stronger in the current climate in which nonprofit workers have really shown our quality as the first defenders and last bulwarks of our democracy and our communities. The problem is that there's been this chronic, systemic, and deeply flawed deficit of investment in the nonprofit workforce. The dearth of support only undermines equity and effectiveness in organizations, on our staffs and volunteers, and actually the effectiveness of our funders and the communities that we serve. So our mission at Fund the People is to reverse this trend, to maximize investment in the nonprofit workforce. We envision an equitable, powerful, and sustainable nonprofit workforce that's able to bring about meaningful and sustained social change and social impact. And we produce, as an organization, we produce ideas, research, practical resources, and other programs that help you to make the case and to get equipped to take action in your own sphere of influence. We bring together stakeholders from across the sector, funders, nonprofits, search firms, and a variety of infrastructure and support organizations to build this movement in the field. And one example of these convening efforts is our advisory council, pictured on this slide at one of its annual meetings. Two of the core principles that have always guided our work since the beginning are as follows. The nonprofit workforce is the most important asset to nonprofit performance, impact, and sustainability. And secondly, that equity and inclusion are central to building a strong nonprofit workforce. So Talent Justice Initiative is the logical result of these two principles. So what is the problem we're trying to address specifically with talent justice? Based on our experiences and on the existing research and conversation in the field, we hypothesize that the deficit of investment in the nonprofit workforce has led to an inequitable pathway for nonprofit work and leadership. And that has caused a bottleneck for many nonprofit professionals at all stages. And we summarize this bottleneck with 3 A's: access, advancement, and ascension. Access to nonprofit careers is challenging. Too many potential and emerging nonprofit professionals and leaders don't have a good map. Too many people don't even know they can have nonprofit careers and have too many problems accessing experience, networks, and jobs that pay decently. So they're stuck on the on-ramps. Advancement is also challenging, with many folks caught in bumper-to-bumper traffic behind long-serving leaders, burning out in place or swerving from here to there to find their way. Ascension is complicated, with people of color, women, and other leaders facing particular barriers when they do get into CEO roles, while many long-serving and often white executive directors are having their own trouble staring longingly as they pass the exit, unable to actually get off the roadway. So without investing to improve the road itself, all 3 stages of this journey, access, advancement, and ascension, without investing in all 3, no one can work well. They need each other. And the bottleneck remains in place without addressing all 3. None of us can drive the social change we wish to see in this circumstance. So taking this as the premise of our research, we organized the study around these 3 broad career stages. And to provide some more organizational context, CURE, the Center for Urban and Racial Equity, also examined issues of organizational culture that influence these 3 A's. Over the last 5 years, we've been developing at Fund the People the idea of talent investing. We define talent investing as intentional deployment of resources to support and develop professionals and leaders in the nonprofit workforce. Talent investing is both about the money and all the other things for which money is simply a proxy: political capital, time, attention, skills. So talent investing can be delivered via grant making or fundraising or other forms of resource mobilization. Therefore, it can come from foundations, donors, government, other philanthropic sources, as well as from nonprofits themselves, the boards and leaders. Really, I believe no matter where you stand in the sector or what your role, you can invest in yourself and your colleagues in one way or another. Based on Fund the People's values and guiding principles, we want to make clear that talent investing won't work without addressing issues of intersectional racial equity and social justice within the nonprofit workforce itself. Conversely, the racial equity and social justice agendas will not succeed if they don't address talent investing. So today we're bridging these two ideas with the concept of talent justice. We define talent justice as practices that utilize investments in nonprofit staff to advance intersectional racial equity across the nonprofit career life cycle. The Talent Justice Initiative, the vehicle for this idea, was planned with three initial phases in mind: research, production of knowledge resources, and webinars and workshops to enable folks in the field to use and improve these resources. So with this webinar, we're completing the second stage of producing materials and entering the third stage. I hope this helps offer some context for where we are today. Wrapping up here, I want to acknowledge the funders who've been supporting this work: American Express, the Barr Foundation, Koch Jr. Fund, Hewlett Foundation, Kresge Foundation, Newman's Own Foundation, and Robert Sterling Clark Foundation. In addition, I want to appreciate some of our past supporters whose thought partnership helped us get here today, and those include the Annie E. Casey Foundation, Ford Foundation, and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. On the screen coming up now, you'll see many of the local and national organizations that were survey distribution partners, and we want to thank them all. In particular, I want to give a shout out to Vule and the nonprofit AF blog. They were hugely helpful in getting the word out. Finally, I want to thank our colleague organizations out in the field. There's been significant work done on racial equity and related issues in philanthropy and in nonprofits for years now, and we don't pretend to be the first, nor do we pretend to be the most expert or skilled in this area. Rather, that we're hoping to contribute a unique perspective to this ongoing conversation and practice. So if you don't know about these other groups, I encourage you to look into them. Building Movement Project and their Race to Lead study. They just released a new research brief actually this week about executive directors, so you should check that out. Change Philanthropy, D5, which is no longer active but does maintain an archive of online resources. Equity in the Center, with which we're very active, and the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, one of the first groups really that has been working away at trying to get funders to invest in racial equity in society. And there are other groups that aren't listed here, obviously, ABFI and their training resources, Facing Race, Conference, and of course, books like Decolonizing Wealth by Edgar Villanueva, who we're glad to have on our advisory council. Finally, I want to recognize our research partner, the Center for Urban and Racial Equity, or CURE. We've worked with them on this initiative, and they've really contributed to the ideas and the rigor. And I can't thank enough Dr. Judy Lubin, Elise Goldstein, and their colleagues for their flexibility, patience, and skill. So with that, I am extremely excited to turn it over to Judy for our feature presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much, Rusty, for that introduction. I also want to thank Yolanda and the entire Fund the People team for what has been a really wonderful partnership. The past year, when we embarked on this research and learning journey, we mutually agreed that we wanted to build on the work that has already been done to shine the light on racial inequities in the sector, and that work led by many of the organizations that Rusty mentioned. And so I'm excited to share the top line findings from the Talent Justice Study with the audience today, and think our findings help to deepen our collective knowledge of the experience of nonprofit professionals, especially professionals of color, and also provide actionable steps for advancing equity in the sector. I also want to thank my team as well for their contributions to the research as well as to the toolkit that's being released today. A little bit about CURE before we get started. So we work with people and organizations to advance equity through policy, systems, and institutional and organizational change. We do this through research and analysis, through planning and consulting and training services. We really see ourselves as part of the movement towards racial equity and structure our work around 4 key strategies. We help to build the case for change through research that identifies gaps and opportunities for action. We help to foster equity-centered organizations through equity assessments and strategy and implementation support. We also facilitate training and learning through opportunities that expand knowledge and build capacity to practice equity, particularly racial equity at the individual, organizational, and communication levels, community levels. And lastly, we help to catalyze ideas and action through design and management of equity-centered programs and activities that center and amplify the voices of underrepresented communities. So using the talent justice framework that Rusty just described, for our study, we wanted to understand the challenges, opportunities, and promising practices for investing in intersectional racial equity across the nonprofit career life cycle. We define intersectional racial equity as a process of leading with race while also being mindful of the ways that gender, age, class, sexual orientation, and other forms of difference contribute to differential outcomes. In contrast to other studies that are focused on the persistent racial leadership gap in the sector, we really wanted to understand how to strengthen talent investing across all levels, because talent justice is needed in all levels across the nonprofit sector to help organizations to really embody their commitment to racial justice and the public good. So for the access phase, we particularly focused on practices that facilitate equitable access or that create racial and socioeconomic barriers to entering the sector. For the advancement phase, we wanted to know what barriers hinder career progression and what practices help create the conditions for retention and advancement in the sector. And lastly, for the ascension phase, we wanted to understand the dynamics of inequity in executive transitions and what practices provide diverse leaders with a runway for success. So we analyzed our data for differences by race, age, gender, sexual orientation, immigration experience, education, income, and disability status. Across these variables, we found statistically significant and meaningful differences by race, age, immigration experience, and education. We also looked for where and how nonprofit, funder, and consultant respondents differed in their perceptions of which practices help to advance workforce equity, especially for people of color across the 3 career phases. So our methodology included a literature review and discussions with leaders in the sector to inform development of the survey. We conducted an online survey and received approximately 1,500 responses, and this included primarily nonprofit professionals. The nonprofit professionals comprised 85% of our sample. We also had participation from foundation staff, which comprised 8% of our sample, and consultants to the sector, which comprised 7% of our sample. We also conducted 3 focus groups and 20 in-depth interviews with early and mid-career nonprofit professionals of color, senior nonprofit professionals of color, and foundation professionals. These interviews and focus groups really help to give us a fuller and deeper picture of the nuances of inequity experienced by nonprofits and to better understand the practices that could advance talent justice. So a little bit about our sample. 60% of our respondents were white and 38% people of color. And you can see here the breakdown of people of color. 12% identify as multiracial, 10% Black, 8% Asian, 6% Latino or Hispanic or Latinx, 1% American Indian or Alaskan Native, and 1% Middle Eastern. The majority of our sample identify as female, 82%, 15% male, and 3% non-binary or transgender. Nearly 50% of the sample were millennials aged 22 to 37, 39% Generation X, and 13% baby boomers are aged 54 to 72. We had a fairly highly educated sample with 40% reporting having earned a bachelor's degree and close to 50% indicating that they had their highest degree earned was a master's degree. Income was fairly normally distributed in our sample. About 70% of respondents clustered in the middle of the income scale, reporting their incomes at $35,000 to a little under $100,000. We also asked about immigrant experience or immigration experience. Most respondents were born in the U.S. with no immediate immigrant experience, while 8% were second generation or reporting having at least one immigrant parent, and 11% of our respondents were born outside of the U.S. So before I go into the key findings of the report, I want to frame our conversation with important context and perspective that was offered by one of our focus group participants. I think this quote really underscores what is needed for us to have honest discussions about the implications of the findings and the change that needs to occur in the sector. And so this was from a quote from a Black female nonprofit professional. She says, as someone who works in a capacity building organization where a lot of organizations are just comfortable with talking the talk, they're not ready to walk the walk. We're not really talking about how our organizations are managed and the leaders that are at the helm of these organizations and how our boards are ran and who sits on boards. So to me, it's a systemic issue and not just the funders do this or this person does that. It's a system issue. Equity needs a system lens to change things. So our report to this point, does not simply put the onus of change on nonprofit professionals, but also focuses on the critical role that philanthropic funders play in the challenges and barriers identified in our study, but also we emphasize the ways in which nonprofits and funders can work together to be a part of the solution. So our first key finding that I want to cover is that funders and nonprofits are making insufficient investments in practices that support workforce equity at access and advancement stages. Across a number of the talent investment practices that you see here that facilitate workforce equity, the reported needs, which are represented by the red bars, tend to outpace reported actions, which are taken by nonprofits, which are reflected by the blue bars, and foundations reflected by the orange bars. So for example, 84% of nonprofit and foundation respondents stated that competitive salaries and benefits are needed to support equitable access to the sector, yet only 41% of foundations provide funding to grantees for these purposes, and only a slightly higher percentage, 46%, of nonprofits reported investing in competitive salaries and benefits. Similarly, 72% indicate that paid internships and fellowships are needed to facilitate equitable, inclusive access to careers in the sector, yet only 41% of foundations and 40% of nonprofits say they're directing resources to paid apprenticeships like fellowships and internships. So there's a considerable divergence in what funders and nonprofits say is needed compared to their current investment levels, even in training and educational opportunities. So you see here, 39% of funders and nonprofits state funding for degree and certificate and training programs is important for supporting equitable access to the sector. However, only 8% of nonprofits are currently providing funding for educational and training programs, and 22% of foundations say they currently provide funds to grantees for these programs. So not only are funders not doing enough to address workforce inequities, we see differences between nonprofit and foundation respondents. When we look at the advancement phase, we see less differences than what we see in the access phase in the slide that I just showed you, but there are some notable divergences that I want to point out in the data. First, the need for a well-functioning HR infrastructure and equitable organizational culture, you see outpace their corresponding investments by nonprofits and funders. So although 30% of nonprofit and foundation respondents agree that a well-functioning HR and infrastructure is important for equity, only 16% of foundations report funding for grantees to support these efforts. And a similar percentage, 16% of nonprofits, report they're currently investing in practices to strengthen their HR infrastructure. Similarly, 60% of foundation and nonprofit respondents state that equitable and inclusive organizational cultures and practices are needed. However, only 38% and 26% of nonprofits and foundations respectively say their organizations are currently investing in these practices. The second key finding I want to highlight is that funders and nonprofits differ on how to promote workforce equity. We found that not only are these practices insufficient, but we saw differences across consultants, foundations, and nonprofits as to which practices they thought were best in terms of facilitating retention and advancement of people of color in the sector. So as you can see here, for each of the practices listed, there are gaps of 10% or more between nonprofit and foundation respondents. In some instances, for example, competitive benefit packages, nonprofit respondents are almost 2 times more likely to believe this practice is important for advancing equity than funders. Foundation professionals are frequently, more likely to say that formal mentorship, a well-functioning HR infrastructure, and a supportive organizational culture is important for fostering the conditions for advancement, while, as you can see, nonprofit employees, often cite a competitive benefits package and the importance of competitive salaries to staying in the sector. So these differences, again, demonstrate a clear dissonance between the needs of nonprofits and the perceptions of those with the resources to support them. And this finding is pretty consistent with some of the work that Bridge Brand Group and Center for Effective Philanthropy has found in terms of when it comes to what nonprofits say they need in order to recruit and develop talent and the types of support foundations actually provide. So getting nonprofits and funders on the same page is critical to leveraging the investments in ways that are most effective, and particularly in ways that are most effective for promoting equity. So when we looked at support for various practices that could facilitate equity, as people of color and other underrepresented groups assume leadership positions such as CEO or executive director positions, we found something really interesting. So unlike the access and advancement phases, we found senior nonprofit leaders were less optimistic about the potential for talent investment practices to create an equitable playing field for leaders of color. So when given this menu of 9 options that included board support for diverse leadership styles, institutional support for the demands of leadership, an environment that enables leaders to take risks and to learn, a wide and inclusive hiring searches, as well as intentional succession planning, the belief that these practices, or the optimism for these practices in terms of their ability to ensure the success for leaders of color remained under 25% among nonprofit leaders, compared to relatively high support for these practices among foundations and consultants to the sector. So the takeaway is that while these practices are important, and we have data in the report that show that these practices do help, particularly people of color, as they ascend to leadership, it's likely that nonprofit professionals, leaders in particular, have more experience, direct experience with the ways in which these practices may be poorly implemented. So this may contribute to less optimism for the ability of these practices to level the playing field. And also there may be a recognition of the scale of the structural change that's needed to dismantle the systems, norms, and organizational culture that produce race, class, and gender-based inequities in the sector. So why don't we move on to finding number 3. So a key finding for us was that low pay is a barrier for young nonprofit workers. So in our sample, young nonprofit professionals, particularly millennials, were really, what was coming through in the data is that they're really feeling the pain of low-paying entry-level jobs more than professionals from preceding generations when they first started their careers. So in our data, young nonprofit professionals were more likely to say that they entered the sector through Service Corps programs and paid internships and fellowships compared to older nonprofit professionals. So 21% of millennials entered the sector through job or Service Corps opportunities, compared to 8% of Generation X and 5% of baby boomers. Similarly, 21% of millennials say paid internships or fellowships facilitated their entry into the nonprofit sector, compared to only 12% of Generation X respondents and 9% of baby boomers. When we looked across age across age, we also saw that millennials were consistently reporting more barriers when they accessed or first entered the sector. And so millennials were more likely to say that people they knew discouraged them from nonprofit work, that they lacked connections when entering the sector, they lacked the skills or experience required, or years of experience. Entry-level opportunities were underpaid, and that entry-level job did not pay well. And then also you see the last one here, internship opportunities were not paid. So our fourth key finding, people of color experience systemic inequities when pursuing nonprofit work. So we saw this across all three phases, in the access phase, the advancement phase, as well as the ascension phase. So what you're seeing here are the barriers reported when accessing the sector. And so people of color were more likely to say that they lacked connections with people in hiring roles, recruitment events. There were no recruitment activities or targeted events within their communities, that they lacked the skills or experience needed to enter or advance through the field, that opportunities like Service Corps programs were underpaid, and that they lacked the degree requirements for advertised positions. When we looked at the advancement phase, there was a consensus among white as well as among white respondents as well as nonprofit professionals of color that heavy workloads leading to burnout was the primary barrier to them remaining and advancing in the sector. So this finding isn't depicted on this slide, but this is important to emphasize the sense of feeling that the heavy workloads are contributing to burnout and inability for people to see themselves staying in the sector. And so this was a consistent finding amongst white respondents as well as people of color. But here, when we look at the barriers reported among respondents, people of color were consistently and overwhelmingly reported experiencing more barriers. So, for example, people of color cited limited room for advancement, poor leadership and management, exclusionary organizational practices, limited or no opportunities for mentorship, and limited or no internal cross-training as barriers to them advancing in the nonprofit sector. To share a quote from one of our focus group participants. And this is from a Latinx non-binary nonprofit professional. And they say that even if you're sitting on the board of an organization that deals with hunger, don't talk about the fact that you experience hunger. Bringing our real lives and real selves to work is considered unprofessional. And so this relates to a clear finding in our study about the role of exclusionary organizational culture within nonprofit workplaces, and the sense that people of color feel that they can't bring their full and authentic selves to work. And so in addition to the open-ended survey responses and in the focus groups, people of color also identified other barriers, including institutional racism and bias among leadership, as well as nepotism and lacking the network connections to influence promotion or retention. So moving on to our fifth key finding, exclusionary organizational cultures and wait-and-see funding hinder advancement of new Americans. So we found that nonprofit professionals with one or more foreign-born parents were significantly more likely to report exclusionary culture and practices as a barrier to advancement. So 43% among those who were born in the U.S. or U.S. territories where one or both of their parents migrated to the U.S., compared to 30% of those born outside the U.S. and 22% for those who had no immediate immigration experience. So for second generation respondents, of which I identified, being an American born in the U.S. closely tied to the immigration experience of their parents, we believe may create a more keen sense of awareness and sensitivity to the contrast between white majority cultural norms that pervade many nonprofit workplaces and the cultural norms that are embraced in practice by their own families and communities. So we also found this practice, the exclusionary organizational culture and wait and see practice also being experienced differently by those with an immigration experience. So senior nonprofit leaders born outside of the U.S. were significantly more likely to say that their ability to succeed was hindered by funders that took a wait and see approach to providing funding following their ascension to leadership. So wait and see can happen when organizations hire people of color or those who have been historically underrepresented to succeed, long-serving white CEOs. The new leaders are often set up to fail by funders that take this wait-and-see approach before deciding to renew funding based on whether or not the new leader is perceived as successful. So as you can imagine, this could destabilize an organization and damage the perception of a new leader. So interestingly, in our focus groups with foundation professionals, participants stated that they were unaware of funders taking a wait-and-see approach, yet we do see evidence in our data that this is happening not only among those with an immigration experience, but we also see that white respondents as well as people of color also report experiencing wait and see. Let's take another 5 seconds to log in our responses. So it looks like 22% of you say that you've benefited from intentional organizational succession planning, compared to 78% who have not benefited or had that experience. So interestingly for us, in our findings, intentional succession planning was one of the key ways that people of color identified as being important for them being able to successfully transition into executive roles in the sector. So our last finding is somewhat of a summation of the other findings, and that is that women's work or nonprofit work means low wages and unfair labor practices. So we know the nonprofit sector is gendered, with the majority of employees identifying as women. In our sample, 82% of nonprofit professionals were women. And so we talked a bit about the prevalence of low wages and the increased emotional labor, particularly experienced by women of color. And yet the highest paying jobs, even though women predominate in the sector, the highest paying jobs historically go to men, even though they are minority in the field. So in the qualitative and survey data, we saw that people of color identified a preponderance of significant barriers, including low salaries and heavy workloads that contribute to poor work-life balance, and that these barriers or inequities have compounding effects or additional pressures on women of color who are often working in exclusionary work environments or having to represent or be the voice of their racial or ethnic group and performing, undervalued emotional labor without additional benefits or compensation. So I wanted to share a couple of quotes from focus group participants that underscore this last finding. And this is from an Asian female nonprofit professional. I work at a space that's mainly people of color, and we talk about equity, gender, and race. And yet it wasn't until a year and a half into my job when I realized that I was making $10,000 less than my fellow coworker, who, while he had a different degree or different level of experience walking in, we were doing the same job for at least a year. And he didn't even know that I was making less than him until I had named what my salary was, and we were trying to hire for more people. Second quote I wanted to share is from a Black female nonprofit professional who says that I show up as a woman of color who is also an immigrant, and I speak up. I'm still one person. If my organization is still predominantly led by, and our board is also led by white people, white women, my speaking up is not changing that. And we are an organization that has equity as part of our mission. So that's where I am. So hearing the voices of our focus group participants, as illustrated through these quotes, really, mentioning or underscoring that, even in organizations that center equity or center equity and social justice, we see these disparities, the sense of exclusion and low wages and pay inequities that contribute to an overall picture of unfair labor practices that exist in the sector. So in conclusion, we need talent justice. We found that there are consistent patterns of systemic exclusion that inhibit the careers of people of color, women, immigrants, and young professionals. Across all three phases of the nonprofit career life cycle, people of color report experiencing more barriers and unique challenges to access, advancement, and ascension in the sector. And the deficits in workforce equity in the sector are related to the general lack of investment in nonprofit talent that Rusty started our conversation with. And this deficit has compounding impact, particularly on people of color, women, and underrepresented groups. So as long as these deficits in talent investments persist, the inequities highlighted in our report will prevent the talent of diverse professionals, including people of color, women, immigrants, and young people, from being fully realized and brought to bear in service of the organizations and communities that they serve. So to build more equitable organizations that effectively leverage the talents of all nonprofit professionals, funder and nonprofits must be willing to invest in transformation of sector-wide and organizational systems, cultures, and practices. So we have highlighted in the report a number of recommendations for funders and nonprofits to begin some of this process of deep transformation and change, and you see some of the recommendations listed here. We encourage you to look at the report and also to look at the toolkit that provides case studies, tools, and strategies to help implement the recommendations. So in closing, I'm going to read part of this quote from one of our focus group participants who identified as a Latino nonprofit professional. So when we're having this conversation, are we actually negotiating for a kinder, more gentle form of exploitation? And for me, that's a very fundamental question. Are we talking about dismantling white supremacy, or are we talking about assimilating into it so that these structures can be cool? And so the quote goes on to continue and note that there is this shift that's happening where we're seeing the diversification of the sector, and women of color in particular are provided opportunities for lead in the sector. But the challenge is, to what extent are we willing to change the dominant practices and norms that continue to produce racial inequities and differential outcomes by race and gender? And so this participant ends with saying that I think those are all spokes of this conversation that have to be raised for us to have an honest conversation. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over back to Yolanda to lead us in facilitation of the Q&A segment.
Thank you for explaining the different key findings, and also for sharing those powerful quotes from the people that participated in the survey, and also that we talked to during the course of our research. So, so we have quite a few questions in our chat box. And I would invite Rusty to come on camera as well, so we can start to get through some of these. So the first question was from Kate Gervais. She asked if the data was disaggregated by race, gender, immigration status, and intersectionality. So Judy, is it?
Yes.
That's your, okay.
Yeah, so we looked at a number of variables to see where there were differences in responses. So we looked by race, by gender, sexual orientation, income, disability status, and immigration experience. We only found statistically significant or really notable differences in responses by race, by age, immigration experience, and in some instances education.
Great, thanks for explaining that. So another question was from Adam. How are responses different between male, female, non-binary, transgender respondents across your survey? And it's a multi-part question, so let's start with that.
Okay. Yeah, so we didn't find, so we looked across gender and we didn't find any notable differences across gender.
Okay. And then there was a follow-up question about, it looked like you shared some wages on labor practices. Were there more?
I'm sorry, Yolanda, can you repeat the question?
Sure. So Adam asked, it looked like you shared some information on wages and labor practices, and if there were more.
Yeah, so we asked survey participants to share their income. So that's the wage data that we have for our particular data set. And then we also looked at what was out there in terms of research that's been done by others in terms of getting a sense of how wages differ across the sector, particularly by gender.
Okay. And then the last part of the question is how do we define exclusionary organizational culture? How would an organization measure whether it's inclusive or exclusionary?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. Yeah, that's a good question. So first I would say, as a person of color, I know what it feels like to be excluded. And so when we talk about white dominant culture, we often talk about quantity versus quality. And so when we talk about challenging white dominant culture and really thinking about inclusive experiences and processes that emphasize qualitative, and so it's a feeling a lot of times. It's, you know when you feel included and you know when you feel excluded. But part of what we see, particularly in our work with clients, is that there are these norms that get set within organizations, and they're unspoken norms about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And a lot of those norms are set by white dominant cultural traits. And so these can be things around, these could be how you define success, what's the measure of success, who you perceive as being successful or a leader, and does that leader has a certain profile that often isn't spoken, but when you look at the pictures of people who lead the organization, there's clearly some racial bias or exclusion happening. And so I think it's important for organizations to identify and define what an inclusive culture looks like for themselves.
Yeah, Judy, and I just I appreciate that response and just wanted to kind of build on the feeling that you mentioned, the feeling that you get when you're at an organization where your culture, your background, your perspective may not necessarily be appreciated or invited. So there is a sense that you're not able to bring your full self into your work. So I think there's a lot of people in the survey and certainly on today's webinar that have experienced that. So I think it's really valuable to name it and also to really kind of get under what that experience feels like and to quantify it, frankly. So I think it's important that that we were able to do that in our research. So Yeah, so we're just scrolling through the questions now. So Frank Velasquez asks, what are the next steps? So I'd like to get started on this response and then invite Judy and Rusty to share their thoughts. So when we launched the research and the project for talent justice, we knew we didn't just want to conduct research and point out where the problems are. We wanted to have a solutions-based focus as far as, first of all, kind of pulling the lens back and looking at the entire nonprofit workforce, from how are people, how can we get more racially, ethnically, and otherwise diverse people into the sector? How do we help support their career growth and their trajectory in the field? So we were intentional about creating a toolkit that built on not just our research, but also a lot of the research and resources that are already available, so that this is about taking action. This is like action-focused research. It's not just research for the sake of research. So, so in addition to the report, we actually have a toolkit that addresses several of the recommendations in the report, and that's a starting point. And frankly, we want to invite those of you that are with us here on this webinar to actually start using those tools and letting us know how they're working for you, how we can improve upon them, how we can iterate them, so that we are building this movement for really truly advancing intersectional racial equity in the nonprofit workforce. So I'll stop there and invite Judy or Rusty if you have any responses you'd like to share.
I think you've covered it, Yolanda, in terms of next steps. There are specific strategies and tools in the toolkit for nonprofits and funders that are really looking for ideas, suggestions, learning for ways in which to implement some of the recommendations highlighted in the report.
Rusty, did you have something to share?
I was just going to say, I think the report highlights this serious disconnect or this set of disconnects between funders and nonprofit folks, and then between people of color and white people. And then there's sort of the consultants in between the funders and the nonprofits, and they sort of tended toward the funder perspective on things, but there's sort of another disconnect within there. So in terms of next steps, I think, and this is maybe not concrete enough, but I think there's a need for more, I guess, listening and learning between those groups. And I think that can happen in local communities or within a funder nonprofit relationship. And hopefully some of this data may be useful for folks to be able to say, hey, let's sit down and have a conversation about, the gaps in perception of problems and solutions.
Great, thanks, Rusty. So let's turn to a question that Diana Alonso Watkins asked. It's a statement and also a question. You spoke of obvious unfair labor practices in the sector. Was there or will there be any analysis of the extent to which the sector is rapidly unionizing as an aspect of furthering equitable approaches and best practices in nonprofit management and leadership?
So we don't have, we didn't collect any data around unionization in our study, but I think that's a great question. Potentially a follow-up research project if there's funders that are interested in this movement towards unionization, that there's additional research that needs to be done to understand the movement and also to help facilitate and support it.
Great. Okay, and another question was sent by Elena. Was the focus here on professionals with advanced degrees, or would this be theoretically equally relevant to frontline staff members without advanced degrees or undergraduate degrees?
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's the latter. It happened that our sample had BAs and masters. Almost 50% of the respondents had masters. I mean, and I think that's just reflective of the sector, that the sense that a lot of jobs in the nonprofit sector require a nonprofit degree, and so folks are going back to school and getting a master's degree out of necessity, or feeling that you need a master's degree in order to advance in the sector. But I think certainly the findings apply to those who don't have BAs or master's degrees, those that are initially entering the sector and may want to continue, but may not have the opportunities in order to do so because of the number of barriers that we outlined in the report.
Great, thank you, Judy. So the chat box is really lively right now. I invite you both to look at it so you can also see the many important comments and questions that are coming in. All right, let's turn to a question.
Yeah.
Yep, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, Yolanda, I just wanted, looking at the chat box, I wanted to lift up the comment from Caldera-Durant that a feeling is a deliberate practice of exclusion. So I did want to lift that up, right? So that this isn't always just something that's subtle or implicit, but that exclusion is also very deliberate and intentional as well. I also wanted to add, when we talk about, going back to the question around, how you create an inclusive culture. So we often talk about, not only the sense of belonging and feeling valued, but also that you have a voice in the work that you do and the work in the organization. We also talk about transparency and having a role in decision making in terms of helping to facilitate an inclusive organizational culture, so that you're shifting power within your organization and not concentrating it just among those who are considered those that have positional leadership, but that in whatever role that you play within the organization, you have a sense of agency and opportunity to shape the trajectory of your day-to-day work.
Thank you, Judy. Thanks for lifting that up. And I also wanted to lift up an important comment that was lifted up about land acknowledgement, and I appreciate getting educated about that. And it was Caldera-Durant who lifted it up, and also Tyra lifted it up for us, and Tyra Erskine. So, we didn't do that when we started this presentation. It's something that, as from the people we want to learn more about, so we're more just informed and respectful when we're doing our presentation. So I wanted to appreciate that that was lifted up in the chat. So we're at 2:40 now. So I wanted to just, if we can just take one more quick question, then we're gonna share some resources, and we're going to tell you a little bit more about an upcoming webinar series about the Talent Justice Initiative, and then we're going to close. So there was a question from Elise about, let me see if I can find it, I'm scrolling now. There was a question about what strategies would you recommend for challenging white dominant norms in nonprofit work culture? So you could give us a response in a couple of minutes to that complicated question. I wanted to lift that one up too.
Yeah, so I'm going to make a plug for the toolkit. So there's a tool that's specifically around challenging white dominant culture. I also encourage folks to look up the work of Tima Okun that specifically focuses on identifying the hallmarks of white supremacist or white dominant culture. And that's a really important tool, and we use that in our work with our clients. But some of those hallmarks of white dominant culture are power hoarding, fear of conflict, sense of urgency, quantity, focusing on quantity over quality. We don't have time to go through each of those, but to look up the work of Tima Okun and the hallmarks of white supremacist culture, to really identify the elements, because oftentimes we're not able to name them, But once we're able to name what those elements are, we can come up with alternative strategies and practices to shift culture within our organization.
Great, Judy, thanks for lifting up the toolkit, and that's a great segue to our next slide. Casey, if you can advance. Thank you. So we are proud to introduce you to talentjustice.org. This is our website where we have the Talent Justice Report, the executive summary, and the toolkit that Judy just referenced. And all these materials are free and available for you now. So we encourage you to access them within the talentjustice.org site, which actually lives in front of people's broader toolkit. You'll also see a series of infographics that focus specifically on access to nonprofit careers, advancing to mid-level management, and then ascending into leadership. And we encourage you to look at these resources, use them in your work, use them when you're in conversation within your organizations, when you're talking to your funders or potential funders. And we definitely want to hear from you about, how these resources are helping you, how they're resonating. Please take a look and share, with your colleagues. We're very excited to be able to release all these today. So in addition to the report, if we can go to the next slide, we have a summer webinar series that's all about talent justice. We will have another webinar on June 12th to discuss the report findings, and we wanted to do another live webinar to give people a chance who weren't able to join us today to participate in that. More details on that are coming. Also, we'll have webinars on access, advancement, and ascension, the 3 nonprofit career life cycles, the data related to that, and also we'll have respondents that represent nonprofits and funders and others that will share their perspectives on, how this resonates for them in their work, in their communities, and also for their organizations. So with that, you'll hear more from us about how to register for those free webinars. So if we can advance to the next slide. So with that, we'd like to thank you for participating in today's webinar. We are sorry that we weren't able to get to all of your questions, but really appreciate your insightful comments, your feedback to us, and also we will see if we can respond to some of these questions offline. But we really appreciate your time today, and we hope to see you at one or more of our future webinars. I'd like to thank Judy Lubin, Rusty, Stahl, also Elise, our colleagues and partners Casey and Liz today for partnering with us on this webinar. And we wish you a very good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.